Mr. Mike. Please focus on. Okay, folks, welcome on to the first panel of hard work we have here is 2014. Thank you all so much for coming along. Thank you for putting up with the technical snafus as we get sorted. The title of this panel is Music Industry in 2024. It's a hoary old chestnut, so we decided to get two non-hoary old chestnuts to speak about. These two people here on the far right in the blue shirt, it is Mr. Darren Hemmings, founder of Motor from Unknown. Tell us about Motor from Unknown.
It's a digital marketing agency. Do I need that?
Can you hear me all now? Oh, I feel like the voice of God. It's a digital marketing agency where we run artist campaigns and main for quite a wide number of labels and clients, including people like Infectious-Music, Secretly Canadian, Fabric. There's a lot of them, basically. Bands like HWCH and Moby and those kinds of things. And also now we're kind of branching out to work beyond that with brands and startups and stuff like that as well.
Excellent. Right, this is going to be we'll talk and try and pass the mic as smoothly as possible. And then in the middle here, it's Fred Bolza, who is the Vice President of Strategy at Sonymusic UK. So tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us about what the Vice President of Strategy does, and tell us as well, just for the I suppose the people in the audience, who the President of Strategy is.
Yes, let's tackle it. There isn't one, that's the brilliant strategy. So there's no one to get assassinated, which means I continue to have a job. So yeah, there is no president of strategy. Vice president is just a title that people use in major labels to make themselves sound more important. And there's a senior vice president, executive vice president, but there is no president. So we got that out of the way, we're okay now? Yeah. You're gonna be all right, Karen. You can giggle all you like. So my job essentially though, because again it's kind of a slightly highfalutin but equally meaningless title, is to work in a not dissimilar way, I suspect, to Darren, but within the label. So the area that I run encompasses digital marketing, social media, digital creative, as well as things like customer relationship management, so direct marketing, and then things like brand partnerships, be those brands, you know, the Nikes or the Pumas of the world, or the Instagrams, the Facebooks, or the Twitters. And then at the heart of it all is a consumer insight function. So in a sense, putting at the center of our business a passion for audiences that is at least equivalent to the passion that we have for artists and music. So it's kind of, that's what it is. It's a bit difficult to describe, but that's the best I can do.
Okay, excellent. So let's start with Darren actually. You know, we're fast forwarding to 2024. What do you think you're going to be doing in 2024? Will you still be running Motor from Unknown? Will you have kind of shuffled on? What will you have done?
I think that it's probably more likely that the company will have a wider spectrum of interest. I mean, there's a definite move on our part at the moment to try and branch out beyond artist campaigns, just because I think there's an inevitability that the market is shrinking. You know, the streaming market's growing, but the rest of it is declining and it's not making up the gap. So while at the minute we're having a short-term win because a lot of labels are laying people off and outsourcing, I don't think it will necessarily last, and it's kind of, I'm not sure how much that market will bottom out. But as a company, basing ourselves in that space is obviously a big risk, which is why we're now taking the expertise to a broader spectrum of clients. So, you know, working with a few startups and things like that, just to try and ensure that as a business, I guess, we have a kind of slightly more stable proposition for the future. And I think the knowledge that we have gained over the years working in this space can be kind of turned around a bit. So from a personal perspective, you know, as the guy, you know, owning and running the company, it's very much understanding that market is going to shift and trying to adapt accordingly. And there is, you know, I think when we realised that there was a sort of hunted gamekeeper element to this, where we could switch sides and advise startups on best ways to call those audiences, because for the last 5-6 years, you know, we've been the people that have been getting pitched all the time, so I feel like we can recognise good product and try and build on that. So in that respect, I think that's where the company will be, which is nice for my business plan, but obviously not so interesting for everyone else. But I think within that contraction and the shift to streaming media, you know, ultimately I still think we've got a period ahead where streaming is going to continue to grow. I'm not at the moment seeing anything coming forward that looks like it's going to topple that. But you never know, and the speed at which things replace other things now is, you know, the time for that to happen is permanently in decline. fine. So there's nothing to say that something can't come along in 5 years and completely upset the apple cart again. And it really depends how things move from there. But if you base it on kind of a 10-year cycle, I think in the last 10 years, in some respects things have shifted a lot, and in others it feels like they haven't actually shifted much at all. So I think it will probably be a much more streaming-dominated market. I suspect there's going to be a whole question mark over the degree to which albums are still a viable proposition and things like that. But in the main, I think it's trying to navigate those waters, and I think the interesting thing will be seeing how that leaves the industry in terms of the way it can operate, the money it has to spend, and all those kinds of things.
Okay. How about you, Fred? What do you think you'll be doing in 10 years' time?
Obviously, I'll be president of strategy. Obviously, that's the key ambition here. I don't know, because I think, if I answer it flippantly, obviously I'd like to be retired and living an amazing life and listening to music for a living instead of talking about how to distribute it. But if we answer it more in a sort of professional sense, in terms of where I am now and who employs me and the type of company that employs me, which is a major label, I don't know that the major label as it currently exists, or the major labels as they currently exist, necessarily continue to exist, because the fundamental shift that Darren's talking about from kind of a product-based unit of commerce called the album to something else where you access music, whether that is a stream, whether that is a YouTube view, whether that is some other form of interaction, and God knows what will come next. That shift from ownership of a product to access to music has a profound impact for a record company, because a record company, the clue is in the name, makes records. And the truth of it is, and it's interesting that you say about brands and startups, actually we live in a world where what we are in fact creating, and again it's language that we don't necessarily like to use in relation to art, but we are creating brands. And it's the brands that then drive revenue streams, whether that is through a product called an album, whether it's through touring, whether it's through merchandise, whether it's through partnerships, a sync, whatever. And so to me, I think the kind of business that we will be running in 10 years, and therefore I hope that I will still be in the business in some kind of capacity, will be much more akin to essentially what's been unbundled by the internet is the record label. Because the product is the bit that's the problem, or the one that is less being consumed. So what that means is there will be new ways for artists to find funding, new ways artists will still need expertise to use that funding to build and develop a fan base and engage with it and scale it if that becomes a need. The product piece is actually the commodity. It almost becomes like a utility. So in a weird way, like I could imagine a world, and I know it's a slightly unpleasant thought for many people in the room, including myself, that it could be exactly like the gas or utility markets have become in many markets, where the actual company that buys the gas and transports it up and down the country is a regulated monopoly, and then everyone around it buys the gas at an agreed wholesale price and then tries to get the most value for it. Now I know that's a slightly weird analogy, but we're entertaining a notional future. What if there was only one colossal product engine that was regulated, so it was fair? And I'm not suggesting I want to be that, and I'm not suggesting that's major label policy, but I just think the product side of it is a problem, and it's building really meaningful connections between artist and audience.
So basically, from what
What would you say? We will definitely go out to Harvey Norman or somewhere and get 2 more microphones before the next session, won't we? Yes, we will. Right. No, so it's interesting what both of you kind of said, because it's a very brave new world we're kind of facing into. You're kind of pointing out, Darren, that there's nothing going to come along to replace streaming in the kind of medium term, right? Maybe long term it's a different matter. You're kind of pointing out as well, Fred, about the way labels going to have to change and adopt to the unbundling that's going on. What about the artist? I mean, this is something the artist is going to have to get used to. From your experience dealing with artists over the last 10 years, how do you think they've dealt well with change, or are they scared by change? Where does the artist fit in 10 years from now? I want to start with that.
I think it totally varies, to be completely honest with you. I know it's a bit of a cop-out, but I've worked with artists that are unbelievably savvy and have kind of taught me, being very visionary in how they operate, and then I've worked with some that are just fucking nightmare. So it completely varies, and I think it does make a big difference in understanding the opportunities that this can present and trying to seize those and manage that without necessarily kind of compromising you as a band or brand. And I think, I've seen a lot of artists that do a very good job of that. And, and particularly, I mean, it's a glib remark, but, I think the best music still often finds its way out to the people. And that plays a big part in it as well. And it's the bit that no one wants to kind of address. Although there was a great article I saw recently that was kind of, are a lot of the problems in the industry just because the music isn't good enough. We sort of having if the music industry is in a kind of fiscal, economical slump, is it also the creative one that is playing a contributing part to that? And I do wonder if there's sort of some degree of merit to that argument that it's not at the moment a particularly vibrant time. But I think with regard to artists, it does totally vary, and I think it's there are so many factors around any artist campaign that building them out and making it work is often can amount to a lightning strike as to whether you get all of the factors lined up and really nail it. I think if you get the right teams working together. I mean, I was looking at something recently where we had to kind of appraise a bunch of artist campaigns, and we were talking about the Ed Sheeran one. And I'm like, I can't stand Ed Sheeran's music, I'm really not a fan. Put that on the record. But I really admire how that campaign's been run, because it's very evident that you've got very smart people at the label, but coupled with clearly a very locked in management and artist. And the fact that he's been everywhere, doing everything, it's a bit. I worked on Dizzy Rascal's Tongue in Cheek album, and it was a bit similar to that. It was like if you needed the artist to go and do something, be somewhere, he was there, and he just rolled up his sleeves and got on with it. And because of that, he really built something out. And it's the same with Ed Sheeran. I may not like his music, but I've got a huge respect for how that whole thing is run, because it's just been so, perfectly kind of gelled together. But it's a perfect example of when it all works, when it all goes the right way, and you get a very locked-in team, and it really, you kind of all profit, because you get very efficient on how you work, and you all understand the way the band is, what they will do, what they won't do, and you get the lie of the land. So then it all just becomes super efficient, and there's no time wasted. Where in other instances I've had, with email threads totaling 200 emails about one Facebook post, and it's focusing on, energies on completely the wrong thing. Whereas others understand where the big wins are, and we will line up and focus on those. And you see the artists that reap the rewards. And as I said, I think the Ed Sheeran one's a really good case in point where they've just got it totally buttoned down, and that's when it works. Everyone shares the same vision. There's no conflict between the parties involved, and you can see that the benefit is there as a result.
Fred, take up that point. There's two things kind of Darren was talking about. Ed Sheeran, we mentioned him last night. We mentioned how Darren was talking about the artist training where they're supposed to be. We're talking about sports stars when they're involved, and they turn up when they're supposed to be there as well. You also kind of mentioned teamwork as well.
I mean, I think the thing is that the best campaigns are the ones where the market is an extension of the art, as opposed to a separate thing that you do to the art. And therefore it's an oppositional thing instead of a complementary thing. So the Ed Sheeran is a perfect example. He himself understands what is going on, not as something that is being done to him by a bunch of horrible people that want to sell his product, but he sees it as an extension of who he wants to be as an artist, how he wants to be perceived, and how he wants to make a meaningful connection with both an existing fan base and ideally a new fan base. And so, to some extent, for me, the key in unlocking this is actually trying to converge. The music industry has got to where it's got to, and part of the reason it's in the straits that it's in is the rights are fragmented. So, in order to get any one thing to happen, you need a manager to agree, you need a publisher to agree, you need a record label to agree. Within the record label, promo, marketing, and A&R might not agree. So there's a lot of ducks that need to be got in a row, whereas if you want to do a campaign with Beckham, provided you can pay the check, he'll do whatever you want, and because you only have to speak to one person. So I think part of what I'm seeing, and it was really encouraging this morning listening to lots of people, is that what I think is happening, and it's a bit like what's happening in the startup world, where because there's no job security for people coming out of university, they're starting things up. And they're making great things, and ultimately that will stand them in good stead, even if they fail as startups and end up in the business world. And I see a whole generation of artists who are actually 2 albums into their career, totally DIY. And interestingly, a lot of the people I spoke to this morning are studying marketing on the side. So they're doing marketing on one hand, and they're playing in bands, and they're making music, and they're releasing, and they're building fan bases. They're completely fluent in a language of what it means on social media. So actually I think this change is going to actually be driven by the artists as much as it might be by the smart peoples in any of the other middlemen. And the interesting thing is, it'll also be driven by the public, who can and will move around to the services that they want. And the interesting thing is that even with a very simple analytics interface, you can see what's going on and where it's happening. So I'm not suggesting that artists go into the music business to become the chief marketing officers or the presidents of strategy of their own business, but actually there's so much you can do, and if you see it as an extension of your art, you know, then that can become quite an interesting place. So I think things are going to change. You can do so much more before you have to give away your intellectual property in return for money.
Yeah.
And in fact, you may never have to do that, which I think is very exciting. The only question that remains, sorry to interrupt, is the editorial filter. What happens to that? And that's something which in the internet, people in book publishing are talking about, people in film, TV, different filters, but it's that just because you can self-publish doesn't mean what you're self-publishing is necessarily any good and may benefit. So there are obviously areas where professional help or services can play a role. But I think this is quite an exciting time, because by learning how to do it yourself, you'll know what to ask your manager, and you'll know how to integrate with all the pieces because you'll understand them.
What about the big beasts who currently exist today? Will we still be talking in terms of like the likes of Spotify, Apple, Twitter, and 10 years from now? You know what I mean? Or like can we see something like Spotify like still existing? You talked there about like streaming. Will another beast come on the pitch? You know, I mean, we saw Apple's play in that kind of regard. Just like we just do a little bit of kind of future scope there. You know, will it change? Will these big technology giants with their big kind of bags of cash in the case of Apple still be as important 10 years from now?
I think their position's relatively unassailable. I mean, it's interesting, I just saw this morning that there's rumours picking about that Apple are about to bottom out the price of Beats below the $10 mark, which so you get back into the kind of Murdoch-led newspaper wars where they, you know, sold the Sun for 5p just to kill off the smaller players in the game, and then up goes the price again. And it seems pretty clear that Apple are going to get aggressive on that front, which with as much money as they've got on a mountain somewhere, you know, in Luxembourg or something, it's, you know, they've got a hell of a margin to really do some damage. And I think you're seeing it elsewhere. You know, Tesco had this Blinkbox thing that they were trying to launch as a sort of combined video-audio platform. You know, now it would appear they're getting rid of that, or may just kill it off altogether. Now it's off the back, and we see Tesco having a reasonably poor round of results. But, you know, they were at one point very aggressive about trying to become a player in that game, you know, to try and own that space. And again, it's just telling that they're trying to retreat because, you know, I don't know, I'm not a party to their discussion, but I would imagine they're looking at what's going on and kind of saying there are much bigger players in this game who we are not going to topple with our current offering. So I think in, you know, over a 10-year cycle, I don't really see that changing because, you know, those kind of the big four are, you know, have huge clout. I still maintain, like, I'm really puzzled by the fact that Facebook's not made a play into this space when their whole kind of strategy is to devolve into an ecosystem of very separate apps. You know, so they now own WhatsApp and they've got Instagram and all these different things. And the kind of music proposition seems screamingly absent from that when they have a pretty good shot at, you know, taking that kind of thing on, and having also nicked a whole load of data insight from people like Spotify because everyone's using Facebook to log into them. But yeah, I think in the short term, you know, well, 10 years is short term. Sign I'm getting on. 10 years doesn't seem like long. I don't really see it changing. I think where Spotify are concerned, you know, people would say that they're unassailable, but I think at this point, if Apple really go hardball with things like pricing, you know, at the moment there's not enough to differentiate these services. They all just offer much the same catalogue, bar a few exclusives, but even those exclusives can topple, you know, and so what Spotify has not yet come under a kind of sustained attack from one of the bigger propositions, because Google have launched theirs, you know, and they're now trying to launch another one in the face of a sort of YouTube offering, but they've never really gone all out, you know, to take Spotify on in that space from the marketing position. They've just kind of put it out there and then left it there, but the whole marketing has been relatively meek. But Apple in particular, if there's one thing they do very well, it's that kind of branded marketing and that kind of thing. So it will certainly be interesting to see, but yeah, I don't see the players in the game at this point particularly changing. Particularly as well because there's been plenty of companies that have grown and become interesting players in the space and just got swallowed by, I mean, WhatsApp is a perfect case in point, you know, and just got hoovered up by Facebook. So yeah, Spotify still, on paper, could go exactly the same way.
I mean, I think back 10 years, which is roughly when I joined the music industry, it was actually 8, 9. And when, at that point in time, the panorama was CDs, iTunes, no Facebook, no Twitter. YouTube was just emerging as a platform, but it was still mainly cats on skateboards and stuff. And there was basically, and there was a thing called MySpace, okay? You flash forward to now, so you come into the present, and you've got Spotify, Deezer, RDO, iTunes, Beats, now owned by Apple. You might find an album in your phone one morning when you wake up. People are experimenting with BitTorrent. So there's like a proliferation of services. So the key question, if this is kind of the moment in time that we're in and we're looking out to the next 10 years, is will it open up into even more? So will the me in 10 years or the someone in 10 years sitting here being asked the very same question by the Jim in 10 years, will he be saying there's even more fucking services now? Or will there be a consolidation? Well, the past dictates that markets always shake out and consolidate. So you would argue that maybe we are in or around a peak. And the interesting thing about what you're saying is the one difference of the big players like Apple and Google and Spotify is, Spotify, we don't know if they're in the game to IPO, so to float themselves and become a company, or whether they're going to get bought. And they're a big player in streaming, but they're a viable player. And if they go or they get bought, just fantasizing, like hypothesizing, I mean, you end up in a situation where you're likely to end up in consolidation. And you will then see, like in every market, 1 or 2 players that own streaming. The question is, will there then be something else that manifests itself that is a growth area? My one belief, and it's a very firm belief, is that the glory days of one format to rule them all is gone. Because in the shift from product to access, that's what changes. It's not actually about streaming or downloads or whatever, it's about the fact that there isn't one way of consuming music at one price point with one distribution model. And that's the bit that's never coming back. So I think there will always be multiple forms of consumption, and I suspect they will proliferate. But at a supply side, in relation to the industry, it's more likely to consolidate than not. Because a lot of those players will not have the heft to deal with the market cap and the cash flow of a business like Google or a business like Apple. And it will be like what happened in record labels, where in the end, you've got one that is 60% of the market, and then you've got everyone else. So my feeling is that there will be more ways of consuming music, but at an industry structure, you will see consolidation, and I suspect it's going to happen sooner rather than later.
You talked there, Fred, about enough of these kind of people who've got like big pots of money. You talk about mountains in Luxembourg full of money, both of you have. So the industry is, and we talked as well, Fred, last night about this in terms of the VC setup for a label for a music company in the future. But one area, one kind of a group of people who look at music quite covetously in many ways now, are making a lot of kind of interesting inroads, both kind of good and bad on brands. And those kind of big commercial brands. Is that going to continue? Are we going to? I know from kind of talking to brands, they all look at something like the Red Bull Music Academy and go, that's what we want, but none of them have the patience to do it. Is there a case of, well, maybe the music industry needs to subtly educate these brands, or is it the case because it's the piper who pays the piper calls the tune? If the brands have got the money, they're going to dictate what's going on.
I mean, I think that the issue where brands come into it, so first of all is, value is neither created nor destroyed, it just drifts somewhere else. So a lot of the value that sat in the music industry in the 80s has gone to tech companies, and that's what's happened in that ecosystem. So there's an issue of the money is sloshing out. Brands are interesting because at the moment, in the social world in which we live, their problem is the way that they used to kind of engage with audiences around their products was a TV spot. But they never, like us, they never really had a conversation. Now in the world of social, it's all about a conversation, it's all about driving engagement, all these buzzwords flying around. And the thing is, it's hard to like a dishwasher on Facebook, but it's easy to have a conversation around of whatever, a dishwasher inside a Beyonce video where the dishwasher plays a starring role, and let your minds run wild with that one. It's not a real example. But so it's quite interesting. What do brands actually think they're going to get out of the music industry? Well, what they want is if you go to Cannes or you go to any of those places, they're talking about storytelling, narratives, engagement. They basically want something to cut through in social media where, as in a set of inanimate objects, typically that's hard to do. So there's a role, because the good news is we make content and it's engaging, and whereas a brand has to compose it carefully, think Instagram picture of a cup of cappuccino all nicely laid out, an artist tweets their toenail and gets 3,500 shares. So that's currency, that's real currency, even though the content isn't necessarily good. So I think there is an opportunity for us there, if you think in a Renaissance way, to attract some dollars out of the media agency and ad land, from Madison Avenue into the music industry. But that comes at a certain cost, and the education process is not one directional, no pun intended. It's also we need to understand them. So there's a whole kind of way of doing it, and at the end of it, of course, I still think and hope that most artists don't wake up in the morning saying, I'm going to start a band because I really want to help Coke sell a few more cans. I hope that people wake up in the morning and say, I just want to make some amazing art, and then it may be that if an extension of that art is doing something with a brand, that is a function of what happens with the music. So the education process is quite significant, but it is interesting to hear Darren say, motive unknown, moving into advising brands. That's the thing, is we've been Muppets for so long, and now people are actually coming and asking us for stuff. It's quite a nice feeling for us.
Yeah. That's the point, Darren, to give us a take on things from the independent side.
I think on the independent side, everyone's just happy when a brand comes knocking, because all we see is pound signs. Brutally honest.
Exactly, but surely there always comes a point when those pound signs and those euro signs can be extended. You can get more out of a relationship. Fred is talking there about building relationships. Sometimes I kind of feel when brands come knocking, brands themselves are just kind of looking to order musicians around, and the musicians just look for quick bucks.
I think at the moment there's definitely a kind of quick bucks element to it. I've seen plenty of labels where they're rejoicing because they've landed a massive sync that would have dwarfed the entire budget for the album campaign to date. So that, I think any label would say that would be very welcome if someone comes along and says we want to put down 800 grand to sync your track in this ad and things like that. I think generally though it feels, particularly on the indie side of things, that it's still quite a disconnected conversation. There's dedicated agencies working in this space which I'm not part of. It's sort of they operate there, but it still feels to me. It's interesting you mentioned. I think a lot of brands look at Red Bull and say we want to do that, but it's a huge investment on their part, and they've made it a kind of media powerhouse. It's not just we've got a label. They've got a whole media wing now. There's a self-standing business that has to wash its own face. So it's not just about peddling the drink. It has to be self-standing. But I think a lot of brands just don't have the wherewithal to kind of make those sorts of moves. I think really from the independent side though, they're not that far along, because indies are small. We don't, unlike a major where there's whole sort of divisions that can be, sharing information and focusing on this and having the overarching strategy. It's like Log J, with whom I work. There's 5 people. And that's it. There's a big team bolting into it, but that team work on other things, including me. I'm not one of the 5. I'm a hired gun as well, and I work on other stuff. So we can kind of bring some knowledge, but we're not there all day, every day to work on that one thing. And so you see it, and again, it touches back a little bit on things like major label marketing campaigns. You can see that they just have more resource, more power, more ability to kind of look longer term, plot things out better, because the economics are there for them. In the indie side, that's not really the case, and so where brands are concerned, I think we're still at the point, to be honest, where indies just hope that a brand will come knocking, and then we'll get something that will land a lot of money. But it feels like that's about as far as it goes at the moment. There's been some interesting tie-ups with brands and labels before, but I don't think any have been meaningful in the sense of presenting a new model for ways in which these things could move forward in the future. It's just not there, and I think ultimately maybe it's because, as I said, by Red Bull setting everything out, that it had to wash its own face. It wasn't just there to push the drink. They've made it a self-standing business, which is a big investment, but for most brands, they just want to push the brand. And I think that's the kind of difference is, all they're interested in is selling more of their brand, whatever it may be, and as such, they're not prepared to invest in a manner that's a bit more self-standing, because it's just not there, not in their interest.
Just something that both of you kind of like been talking about as you speak. One of my nose is that it's a changing attitude. That anyone who works in music, in that exchange, in the middle of that exchange between the artist and the audience, the attitude's going to have to change in the next kind of maybe 10 years. You're going to have to be a lot more flexible, nimble, agile, all these kind of words. It's like if you were giving kind of advice to people right now, give advice to your peers, what would it be in terms of mind change, mindsets, and things like that?
I mean, from my side, certainly, it's trying to, it's frustrating because I think within artists generally can, they're creative people, and unfortunately, creative people often aren't necessarily rational. There's a sort of difference there. They may not necessarily be as logical about stuff, I guess. I think the artists that work best have as Fred said, really, they have a clear understanding of how to manage this, and it become a part of their campaign, not this kind of dirty thing that they did on the side that rather no one knew about. And so I think the savvy artists pull this stuff in and embrace it. And so how can we make it us? How can this be a logical extension to the things we're doing, rather than just like a horrible set of compromises? And I think that, the best artists you see out there do that, and they turn this around and they take it on and make it something that they can use to further empower themselves beyond it just being a retail fiscal relationship. And so I think with artists, it's trying just to get them to buy into that stuff. Because we've seen so many that are just unbelievably closed-minded and just say a flat no to exploring options that could theoretically really, really make a difference. But equally, it's not for me to say when artists are right or wrong. I've worked with artists before who kind of, perhaps oddly, given what I do for a living, they can't stand the online space at all. And we have to try and work out how to work with a band that has a fundamental dislike of things like social media. And it's not for me to say that their worldview on that is incorrect. We just have to do what we can around it. But maybe the reality is that if you are fundamentally against the biggest channels and means to reach audiences, then there's a limit to how far you're going to get with that. But it's not, I can't say it's wrong. It's just maybe if you were, down at the bank pitching for a loan from your bank manager and they were kind of explaining that, then I would give them a lot less money because I'd be expecting to see a lot less back. Whereas the ones that are savvy and locked in, and embracing much bigger spends, much bigger budgets, clearly you're going to get a bigger return on your investment.
Fred, we talked about this last night. We just talked about that changing skill set and that changing kind of attitude as well. Is that what you'd like to add to what Darren just said?
Because I think what I said before, and it's right, is that, and what Darren's saying is absolutely right, which is in the end, the decision at the core of it lives and resides at the source, which is the creator. As soon as it leaves the lips of the creator, it's in the hands of a series of middlemen until it hits the receiver, which is the fan. Those two are the only two people that actually matter. And I think part of the issue is that what happens now with a colossal amount of music being made and the means of making music so accessible to all is there's much more music. And there's also, I think, an illusion, which is understandable because it comes from the type of talent shows, it comes from all sorts of societal factors. There's a belief that just because you can self-publish, what you've self-published is good. So, and I think, but equally, what I'm incredibly impressed by, or more artists I get to meet, is how many people, when you ask them, okay, well, how do you use all these things? What do you like? What are the bands that you like? How do you follow music? How do you listen? Suddenly you're in a very different conversation. And so, it only works. You can't bullshit a bullshitter. That's what the internet teaches you. So you have to be true to yourself, which means you have to know what you're about. It's a bit like going to a job interview, a bank manager, or chatting someone up at a bar. You don't come in with a weak line first. You've got to kind of deliver some kind of impactful statement of intent about what you are. And it should be, rooted in the art, so to speak. But at the same time, there is no shame in talking. If you're not in it to gain an audience, and you're not in it to make some form of a living out of it in an ideal world, then what are you doing? So, and you know, you're ultimately asking people to part with money, with time, with attention, with whatever, to engage with you. So, you know, it's a bit like what we were talking about yesterday. It's they're looking to the artist to live the life that they can't live. There's something very important in that relationship in terms of what it gives to the fan as a human being. So that's quite a big responsibility you've got as an artist. You've got to take it seriously. You've got to take yourself seriously, which means you have to be able to articulate your vision beyond, you know, mixing tunes, you know. So, but having said that, my feeling is that there is a lot of that. There is a lot of that vision. There is more savviness than not, but there is still quite a lot of education that needs to happen about how you can do these things, and there are multiple ways of doing it. So the "it depends" answer is actually probably the one that you're going to hear the most, because it depends on the artist and it depends on the audience and how you make that connection. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. John says. Last question for me before we get some questions from the audience is: do you think in 10 years' time we'll still be kind of amused by the novelty idea of a band sticking an album in 500 million iTunes libraries, or an act using BitTorrent to release a new album, or an act using the dark web to kind of announce a new album? I think, like, I mean, these things which have happened with U2, Tommy Walker, and Aphex Twin in the last month. I mean, like, September was an amazing month for very unsexy music business stories about delivery solutions. You know, will we have moved on, or will these things always still kind of hold sway?
I think basically they're all just things that make you give it an excuse to stand out and be a point of conversation. I mean, I thought the U2 thing was fucking awful on every conceivable level, but we all talked about it endlessly. So in that sense, it was if the argument, which I may dispute in the case of anything U2 related, is that there's no such thing as bad publicity, then they smashed it on that one. But I think having those talking points, that's not changed. You know, the mechanics of like popular culture, marketing, and how people share things, discuss things hasn't changed. The platforms on which it happens have, but the actual things of it hasn't. From Sex Pistols, Bill Grundy, all those things go on, and everyone talks about it. And that's all you want, is for your band to be the one on everyone's lips by one means or another. As I said, it may be that despite from where I sit, the overall reaction to the U2 thing being largely negative, they may, in their bubble, consider that a big win, at a point where maybe the last album was just met with a much greater rational difference. So no, I think whatever people use, there'll always be a way to just try and become the thing people are talking about, and I think that's part of the art. I mean, I think there's an interesting discussion that spreads out from that, where it's kind of things like with the emergence of YouTube and things like that, and particularly in the US, where YouTube plays are becoming more of a factor in charts and buzz that people use to rate what's good and what's bad. Is that what leads to a sort of Miley Cyrus and there was suddenly a rash of like lots of topless women in videos and all these kinds of things that were just, the Miley Cyrus thing was genius on the level that whether you hated it or loved it, you had to watch it to see what a train wreck it was. And so it was all good news, so it guaranteed them a #1 spot. And in that sense, it's like, that's really clever. It's pretty evil, but it's really clever, very shrewd thinking. So I think, that all of that will be the same. It's just the platforms on which we do it will be slightly different. But it's always been like that, forever and a day. Elvis, getting censored because he was shaking his hips on whichever TV show it was. It's been like that forever. It'll carry on being like that.
Yeah, see, I agree. I think the thing is, all of these things, the honesty box thing in its time, these are all marketing campaigns, and they recognize a wider truth, which is a retail, like iTunes is a retail platform, it's a marketing platform, and it's a promotional vehicle. So it's everything in one. Same goes for Spotify, same goes for all of them. So in a sense, it's not really, it's seizing the fact that everyone debates where the music industry is headed in terms of distribution as an opportunity to do a marketing campaign. It's no different than floating Michael Jackson's statue down the Thames.
Cool. Right. Okay. Any kind of questions from the floor? I mean, this has been a kind of fairly loose ramble, so any questions from the floor don't involve job titles would be great.
Hi, Ben from CQ. I've got a question directed at both of you. You talked a lot about campaigns, and the music industry talks a lot about campaigns. With the demise of the album, To what extent is the campaign changing? Because the album used to be the focal point of the campaign, so to what extent is the campaign changing? And then in turn, how is the role of the record company going to change with the kind of rise of Spotify and streaming and the demise of the album and the rise of managers controlling careers over a longer arc of time than just the album campaign?
Okay. Who wants to go first?
I'll tell you the interesting model on that for me was Q Prime. I met with one of the guys at Q Prime Management a few months ago, and it was just really interesting because he's taken Metallica have come away from their label. It's ostensibly their own label. But Q Prime is now like a staff of 40 people, and they all have the roles of a record label. And I would imagine the majors in some respects are shitting themselves at the sight of Q Prime, who have like Chili Peppers, AC/DC, big names, big bankable names, and clearly at the first chance they get, whip all of them out and take them back in-house. But it's just interesting to see that as a company growing. They now have their own digital department, they're negotiating all this stuff directly, and they're pretty much just locked out the labels where possible to suit themselves. And I think then you're seeing the move from a campaign to just work with the artist. And there is no campaign, it's an ongoing artist management, brand management exercise for Metallica, where they're just getting involved in all these things and managing over a longer period. And I think from where I sit with the artists that really hit that point as long-term propositions, then there will be a lot more of that. And I'm seeing more and more managers hiring digital people, and even as an agency where we used to only get hired by labels, we now do much more work with managers where they're hiring us in because they want us to be working, representing their interests and not solely those of the label and label campaign. So, yeah, I think Q Prime is definitely the ones that I was keeping an eye on relative to where the future lies with that. I mean, I think there's always that problem, it's the Tom York problem where, Tom York giving something away on BitTorrent doesn't mean much to me because he was Tom York to start with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it doesn't, there's no, anyone who's super famous going, I'm going to do this. And but when you're a new manager,
it's the same with Q Prime though. Darren, the bands you mentioned, they've all got established audiences, and those audiences were established via the old-fashioned way, via gatekeepers, via labels.
I think it's true that I'm seeing this with management companies. We work a lot with modest management who manage One Direction and Little Mix and all this, and they've got a commercial department, they've got a digital team, and they are taking strategic decisions for their artists and then briefing us on the bits of the campaign that are relevant to them, essentially. And that's kind of right. The question I do have is, I've never seen them put their hands in their pockets and fund the launch of an artist. So where does the capital come from? So that's still a role where maybe they will first you build up a legacy business, a catalog business if you will, and then you use that to fund starting new artists. That may well happen. But I think the power will lie for the management, because if it follows that if you're shifting from product to brand, the only person that represents all the interests of the artist as brand is the manager. It's not the record label, it's not the publisher, it's not the agent, it's not the merchant. So it follows that it should go that way. And interestingly, a lot of where some of our thinking is could we unbundle ourselves, bring the ability to invest in talent and some of the execution capability, maybe we should be trying to displace managers. So it's a thought. In relation to your other question about singles versus albums, I don't know that the album is dead, but I always find it fascinating that everyone's suddenly got this amazing love for the album. But if you go back to the 50s, because we are in the 50s on steroids now, right? The 50s was just songs, yeah? What is it? Throw an A side, what's on the B side? The mashed potato, some bollocks instrumental thing. And people just singles. And the first albums, the first Beatles albums, the first Stones album were bundles of singles. So where did this love for the album come from? I think I can count on my hand the artists who, as a unit of art, not as a unit of commerce, actually think of the album as a thing, rather than an aggregation of songs. If it's an aggregation of songs, it's not actually an album anyway. And for me, sitting in senior management team meeting every Monday, looking at how the business is going, the best thing that ever happened to those meetings was streaming going into the charts. It's super exciting. Questions about how far forward do you release on Spotify, what happens, how do you get a chart? It's reinvigorated the whole business. So actually this kind of 50s on steroids, like we've been here before. So what if it's a singles-based market? The people that make albums will continue to make albums as art, and will therefore have to sell the albums as albums. But if the albums are just aggregation of songs, then this is a fantastic world to be alive in because it's all about the songs. So I worry less about it. I should worry more about it because 99% of our contracts are for albums, so that's a bit of a disconnect. But this is very exciting, and it brings it back to a kind of Tin Pan Alley. Like it's, I don't know, as someone who's passionate about the past, I think this is very exciting, and it has galvanized the business like nothing in the last. Every new development in digital over the last 5 years has been met with, Jesus Christ, do we have to fucking do this? Could we not just like hold back from this? And now it's like streaming's in the chart. Oh my God, the charts are like exploding. Everyone's talking about it again. Super exciting. So the two things are kind of connected somehow, but I don't know how to connect them. Maybe after a beer.
Okay, I think I have one question. Lynn?
Lyndon Stevens, Tackle Side Music. Mine's about streaming. Basically, do you think, if obviously you talked about two possible scenarios there of it shaking down to just one, if Spotify becoming the one place where we consume your music, what would stop them becoming a record label and signing their own IP and therefore, and more or less creating and making money from the side, for the media rights and things like that. And then the other one would be, if you do get a more fractured scenario where you've got streaming services based on each other, would windowing come into play in terms of where you see with House of Cards or things like that, where they will actually try and pull great content to actually pull people onto their streaming service above others?
Okay, Spotify label.
Well, I mean, it's theoretically possible, but to become a label, you have to take on all the obligations of the label. And just because you're a distributor of music doesn't make you a label, in the same way that being a label doesn't qualify you to be a distributor of music. So you'd be careful what you wish for if you were Spotify. But what I will say is that's what's happening in television. So Netflix is a commissioner of content now. So House of Cards is commissioned by Netflix. So they're both paying for the content and using it to exclusively distribute, and that's what's driving subscriptions to there. So it's funny that, I think Darren said it earlier, which is there's absolutely zero differentiation right now between any of the streaming services. It's $9.99 or free, it's 20 million tracks, it's maybe a person that decides what to offer you, or an algorithm, or a combination of a person and an algorithm, and they're all exactly the same except for the user interfaces. So there's no differentiation. And I'm surprised that no one's used exclusive content more to drive people, which is starting to happen with pre-album release streams and all this sort of stuff. So it's theoretically possible. It surprises me that Spotify or that they don't commission some bespoke content that is exclusive to them. It could theoretically happen, and it might be an interesting model. I just don't see. If Apple wanted to be a record label, their annual cash flow is enough to buy the entire major label system with spare change. So if they wanted to become a record label, they already would have. I don't see why they would. If they want to commission exclusive content, they can do that now. They did with U2. Distribution wasn't so good then.
That's where it's down.
Just to touching on the windowing thing, I mean, I'm still yet to see a particularly great case for windowing. It feels like one of those strange discussions that happens at an industry level where everyone agrees that it's like a good idea and it completely ignores the consumers. And everyone I know, where something's been windowed, they've just gone, that's fine, I'll just pirate it. Like, I don't, if it's not available, they'll just, and it's that level of discussion that no one wants to have. Like, I used to kept getting in trouble when at meetings I would remark that no one who uses Spotify would buy an album, and I got in a couple of really, wasn't appreciated in making those remarks, but I still stand by it. And now people are coming around to accepting the notion that if you can listen on Spotify, you're probably unlikely to go out and buy the record. I think some people do, and they might buy the vinyl and things like that, but generally speaking, it's not likely to happen. So I think the windowing thing for me, I just can't find. I'm yet to see a case where it seems like a very good idea. I think the guy that founded Shazam, who kind of revisited this recently, going, the answer is windowing, and someone else sort of, have we had this conversation? Can we do all this? And the answer is no, it just doesn't work. There's no case for it. And everyone held up Coldplay's record saying the window that worked. And then I think the Florence and the Machine record that came out the following week wasn't windowed and sold just as many copies. It was like, there's not decent evidence there to suggest that will ever work. So, and as far as Spotify's labels, I'm with Fred. I mean, they could do it, and people have tried it, but it just doesn't work, and it's too much of a pain, I think, to take it on, particularly across more companies where, I mean, Spotify are a music company, but they're one of very few. And if you project forward 10 years to neatly bring this back round to the theme here, then, you know, more likely, I would imagine that Spotify's been swallowed up by one of the others whose agenda is not really anything to do with music. Music's just the sweetener to you know, sell in their services. So the whole notion of signing music is like, why bother? You know, that's not where the gravy is for them. There's a whole raft of other places to make that.
Cool, thank you very much. That's great. Can we round of applause, please, for Darren and Fred? They're hereby booked for Hard Work Class Heroes 2034. 2024.